Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Research in Perspective, Fieldwork, Kinship, and Material Activations. Now, this is part of our ongoing collaboration with the Willem de Kooning Academy. We have Concordia faculty and artists Miranda Smitheram and Yuen Kit Lo, who are visiting Willem de Kooning Academy today and are presenting there live from Rotterdam, but also live stream back here to both YouTube and here at Fourth Space. Here at Fourth Space, we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and the future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Over here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities that examine research questions and projects, things happening all across the university. Now, we're also running this today as a live stream, as you can see, to YouTube and via Zoom. So if you're joining us there and you have comments or questions, pop those into the chat and we will do our best to get those into the Q&A a little bit later if we can. And those of you here with us in this space, just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone around and try and make it work that way. Okay. But that is very much my pleasure to pass the microphone across the ocean to our project lead at the Willem de Kooning. We have Skye Mall O'Brien. Skye, it's so great to connect with you.
Thanks, Doug.
This is me clapping.
You'll be able to hear me. Is it working out?
That's good. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Maybe we don't need to see me at this angle though, but I'm going to take the earbud out. Yeah, it's really wonderful. Double fill art as well. As Doug mentioned, Dr. Miranda Smitheram, who will be presenting a talk called Fieldwork, Kinship, Assemblages, and Material Aesthetic Activations. And we have Yuen Kit Lo, who is a friend from back in the day as well, so it's such an honor that our lives are talking again. And he will be presenting a talk called Matters for Spirit on Publishing to Find Comrades. And as Doug also mentioned, my name is Skye Mall O'Brien, and I work as a theory lecturer this year at Willem de Kooning, and I will be the host and maybe moderator at the first time this afternoon here and this morning in Montreal. I'm also going to take a second to read a little something before, and it'll make sense as to why I'm doing this for this event. So really, it's such an honor to welcome two brilliant artists and scholars from Concordia University. Their visit marks... Oh, okay. Is this better? Maybe?
Yes.
Yes, it is better.
Okay, I'm going to put the earphone back in. So really, it's such an honor to welcome these two brilliant humans, artists and scholars from Concordia University. Their visit marks the 11th and 12th exchange, and it also marks the last moment Willem de Kooning will host as part of this ongoing Erasmus Plus project between the two schools. So through these funded mobilities, we have experimented together through workshops, shared curriculum, exchanged methods of documentation while looking at the overlaps between artistic research and research creation, teaching, and also making public. And we've also made some really wonderful personal as well as professional connections where our political commitments and pedagogical values have really been able to intersect. And acting as the project lead of this collaboration has really been one of the most rewarding parts of my job for the past 4 years. So connecting, conversing, and sharing strategies, tools, resources, ideas, and passions from and between two places I call home with such amazing thinkers and creators has been really, truly inspiring and like a deeply important part of this task. So thanks. And I also will take time to talk about the land we're on today, because this is also a tradition I do in my own work. being from, well, you'll hear. So I was born to a Scottish mother on unceded Anishinaabe territories as a settler in Canada. And as an adult, I mostly lived on the island of Chipchoge, which is commonly called Montreal today, where Concordia University is housed and where both Kevin and Miranda live. Currently, I live here in Rotterdam, where we all find ourselves together today, sitting near the edge of the Maas River, 30 kilometers from the North Sea. Rotterdam is a city that lies below sea level, built on deltas and floodplains with its colonial roots running deep. Acknowledging land is a tradition I was taught, and it's about paying respects to Indigenous peoples and lands and the treaty agreements I was born into. But today I really take the time to point out these relationships, to recognize the responsibility that I carry, but also to illustrate the complexity and layers of connection between our bodies and spaces and soils and sediments and the coasts, which really tether us across the Atlantic through these complicated histories, shared presence, and really hopes for maybe a radically different future. And so today, the three of us, at least, and maybe some of you, we come together as guests on these sandy soils, and I'm very much looking forward to listening, as well as entering a dialogue and learning from all of you and, yeah, the knowledge you hold. So please really help me in warmly welcoming Dr. Miranda Smitheram and Kevin Yuen Kit Lo. So Miranda, you will go first, right? I can read your introduction too then. Your bio, is that okay? I'm like all prepared with my paper. I was not prepared with the text, but the paper I have. So Dr. Miranda Smitheram is an artist, designer, research, and educator who develops hybrid materials to contribute to sustainable, relational, and post-colonial futures, centering an approach to crafting with the environment. This is explored through digital, physical, and hybrid materialities. Miranda's current research investigates ontologies of kinship through invasive species, and she applies this to a decolonial design approach, or approaches, rematerializing invasive plant species into soft services, biocomposite, and textile applications. Dr. Smitheram is the co-director of the Textiles and Materiality Research Cluster and director of MASH Lab at Milieu Institute of Arts, Culture, and Technologies at Concordia University. She's now, like, there's a multiple list beside her name. She's an associate professor of material futures in the Department of Design and Computation Arts. And as I said, she's the director of the MASH Lab and a co-director of Textiles and Materialities Research Cluster at Milieu, as well as she is a co-investigator at Hexagram, the Research Creation Network of Arts, Culture, and Technologies. And I am very happy to welcome her in Rotterdam. So please.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui, welcome, and really beautiful introduction, Guy. And thank you also to Doug for the wonderful territorial acknowledgement. The reason...
Maybe, yeah, we're going to...
Oh.
Because, yeah, we don't want to just see you talking.
Can
we focus on the, I guess, this presentation? Yeah. Or maybe just Doug to do that.
Oh, there we go. Yes. I love how that sounds visible to everyone. It's just been hanging on
multiple screens. Oh, yeah, exactly. Okay, sorry about that. To listen to the carrying on the introduction, the reason I have such a kind of list of things under my name is because I'm really collaborative.
And there's other memberships actually that I could be on there too. I'm also a founding member of Indigenous Features Research Centre. But basically I like working with people as well as place and things. I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I'm Kaitahu Southern Māori, and also with Swedish, Whalers, in the mix, and a little bit of Scottish and Irish somewhere. But I have no connection to those cultures, but being raised in New Zealand, I have a strong connection to my Māori culture. So today, what I wanted to present to you was a bit of a reflection across past and present research creation projects and artworks, and the ones I'm presenting all respond to and engage with making with the ecosystem. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts and insights into research threads that kind of unfolded across those things that I didn't necessarily notice at the time, but in hindsight, as we all know, and particularly in research, there's that real sort of joy in sort of finding those threads of connection and those reasons why you are taking these choices along the way. So the research threads that have unfolded for me have been across these different scales and temporalities and across countries, cultures, landscapes and time. And through these, I've really thought a lot about deep collaboration and the life force of things, embodied knowledges, and slowing down to the speed of seasons, and even adjusting a little bit more recently within my research to thinking through questions of migration and how that impacts us in our bodies and in our sensorial exploration of being where we are. So a couple of the kind of key things that I wanted to, the concepts that I'm talking about. The first was people, place, and things, and through that I talk a lot about Māori, which is a concept for Masaranga Māori, for Māori knowledge and ways of knowing, that speaks about the life force of things, about the innate energy and liveliness that exists within all things. I mentioned before a little bit about slowing down to the speed of seasons, but I realized that time and temporality has become really inadvertently, I had no desire for that, but a very centralized part of all of my research projects. And in fact, I actively build that in now to my projects and ways of thinking, particularly in collaborations, because in Pacifica culture, we have a word called ba, or a concept called ba, and it means both time and space. So in essence, it's saying that the theory of relativity, we already understood that in this particular way, forever. But time and space sort of come into these things quite a lot. So the duration of the artworks themselves, but also the relationship building, which happens in both layers and sediments, which is interesting. So these deep collaborations have unfolded really organically, but there's a real sort of centering in them around ideas of place keeping, place making, kaitiaki kanga, which is a word for stewardship or guardianship, and it's a moral responsibility and imperative to take care of the land that takes care of you. And these connections to land through culture and connecting to culture through the land, how those things become embodied knowledge. So some of the methods and methodologies that I'm talking about are research creation or artistic research as a recursive, oscillating, and really porous kind of process. A couple of some of the foundational sort of Masaranga Māori concepts, so ways of knowing from my culture, and how that informs tikanga or protocols, like how to do research. Whakapapa, which can be understood as genealogy, and also geology of life forms. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Kinship assemblages, which is a terminology that I tend to use in my research and have a kind of understanding of within my practice, and material aesthetic activations and remediated materiality. So I'm going through a number of projects, but again, the introduction I gave you to the key concepts is really the void rather than the project. So I won't necessarily be showing you all that much of the projects, but the parts that are relevant to the process. So the first project was my PhD actually, and that was from 2014 to 2017. And this was about unfolding ontologies and aesthetics through digital and virtual materiality. I'd come straight from a career in fashion and textile design, and I wanted to really understand something about tactility and haptics of material itself, of materiality itself. And what was really important with this process was actually the generosity of collaborations and how that turned my research into completely different tangents, and I can see through lines, even though my research is very different direction now, I can still see through lines as to how this impressed upon me some particular things, and in particular embodiment as an activation for materiality, liveliness and palpability, thinking about the transliteration between digital, virtual and physical, and some sort of hybrid materialities. As I mentioned, the kindness and the rich generosity of collaborators and discovery of working with other methods and other mediums outside of the disciplinary boundaries. So in this project, I was introduced to motion capture by a very kind professor who had nothing to do with my project, but understood something that I was trying to kind of understand, and he let me come and work in this motion capture lab. And in the motion capture lab, I did a number of things. I worked with a choreographer and a dancer, both from an Indigenous dance company. And that happened when I started realizing that things I was trying to understand about working with fabric in a virtual and digital space needed bodies to be alive, that looking at the fabric static wasn't possible. So I did a number of sort of versions of things. One was I created a textile that was embedded with retroreflective sensors, which you see a little bit on the left. You see the point cloud of that, which was able to track mutable movement in a digital and virtual space and separate the physical from the actual motion itself. And the second was I used the dancer's movement to generate a virtual cloth simulation. And so the key kind of points, which this is some parts of the final exhibition work, but the key points about that was when I sort of first came into contact with this really important collaborator and mentor to me, Yuen Kit, and we started working together and really thinking about how bodies enliven materiality and understandings, and how this helped me in building philosophical position there as well. The next project that I'm talking about is Phenomenal Dress, which was part of a Māori postdoctoral research fellowship that I did for 2 years in the Waitaki Ranges in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The time span of that is 2017 to 2019, but the time span was also mineral, geologic, and ancestral. I worked with a lot of collaborators in that project. I had my professor who was supervising the project. We also worked with engineers, Atamira Dance Company, who you just saw I met earlier. We worked with cultural advisors, geologists, and there are also children and family members who came along because we were working on a very remote beach, and we'd be out there all day or for very long periods of time. So, yeah. The life forms that we worked with in that project were primarily titanomagnetite, which is magnetic iron sand that comes from a 2.5 million year old feldspar from a volcanic eruptions further down the island, which washed up into the shorelines there. So we worked with the iron sand, the rocks themselves, and the volcanoes that they came from, the Pacific Ocean, the tides and the currents, the sea salt, seaweed, benefic, lichen, and kodu trees. I'll get to the kodu trees in a little minute. The insights and outcomes for that were really numerous and I think helped ultimately the development of my research perspectives now. One of the concepts that we're working with then, this is in 2017, was these ideas around new materialism. And that was really pivotal for me in understanding that new materialism is actually ancient materialism, and it's also understood through indigenous knowledges, but it wasn't published in academia that same way. And so these ideas around modi or life force that I talked about earlier, and this deepening of collaborations and how that extends to both place and things within place was really helpful for thinking about how matter becomes material, becomes research creation or artistic output. In this project, there was also a really strong connection with the place, which I'll show you a little bit here. So in the place itself, it being really remote, it's under the cultural authority of Te Kauro Maki, a particular iwi or tribal group that I don't have a personal affiliation to. And so to work there, I was in touch with them, and they were, we realized immediately, because I also lived in this region, this area, that they, as an iwi, were really under the like in a state of disarray. And why they were in a state of disarray was because we had this soil-borne vector called Cody dieback, basically a disease that was attacking this cornerstone species of trees called Cody trees. And we view these particular trees as being ancestors, like they're one of the most important trees in the forest. So in working in this place, how I ended up working with the local group who have the custody or the guardianship of that place was that I was highly involved in the galvanizing protests and eventually council support and action around placing a rahui on the forest. And now that's something that happens throughout New Zealand quite frequently, but then that hadn't happened on that scale. And a rahui is basically when it's decided it's not a time for humans to be there. Humans need to stay out of that place. So at first, we were doing that in a very ad hoc way, like by making flyers and standing in the car parks outside these forests to ask people not to go walk there today, but go walk somewhere else, because the dieback disease was spreading mostly by foot traffic through the forest. So this project became all these kind of things, and in the project we were thinking constantly about phenomena and agency of the material world, and of course at this critical moment of environmental crisis, but then somehow became involved in a very sort of direct action around that. And so this expanded notion of collaboration started to really become kind of more deeply felt within me about thinking about not just human collaborators, but more than human participants. In this place, we sort of designed these speculative kind of post-human services. We were thinking about how we could kind of inhabit wind and how we could have these phenomena, these experiences of being within phenomena through structures and entanglements. Here you see Jasmine Flower, one of the dancers from Concordia. So they came onto this project because they all lived in this place and were involved in the Rahui Action Protecting Forest as well. So we continued that collaboration. The artifacts that we designed and worked with drew from sociocultural and geological information embedded in the matter, and we created these biomaterial textiles and sculptural forms, and then they're embodied through performance and documented through digital mediums. And through this, I started sort of developing and really gaining more understanding of Mātauranga Māori, of Māori knowledge and ways of knowing. And at first I felt very shy about that because I didn't feel that I had much depth of knowledge, but the depth of knowledge only comes from trying and having conversations and things, developing the time. There was also a lot of reciprocity in this project, and through exchange between elements and beings, and the histories of the sand itself, and the relationships of people to place. So the dance company were also working on a different production at that same time around sand, and a creation story we have around sand. So we did this workshop together with some of the biomaterials developing sand. And in this, one of the most important things that came up for me was in tracing the sociocultural histories of things and seeing the relationships between, for instance, the grain of sand and the volcano that it came from, the eruption 2.5 million years ago from, that under a microscope, one grain of sand really echoed something of the conical structure of the volcano itself. There was also cosmological stories around why the volcano erupted that we thought about and talked about a lot. So the experimentation kind of expanded out in these ways. So yeah, there's thinking about those kind of critical processes of looking at the macro and the micro and these experimentation. There were kind of two things that were really pivotal, and that was things that incorporate doing and undoing. So I thought about mediation as being a human cultural process and applied to metaflows and materiality through technologies. But we also see mediation as being strands of connectivity between non-human, humans, and place through interaction with the environment and its impacts on place. So assemblage is sensed, it's noticed and witnessed as a process of binding between matter and place. Through histories, through cultural actions and liveliness between matter and place. So we thought quite a bit about these sort of ideas around assemblages, then collections or gatherings, how that they are relational and they are for heterogeneous things and their liaisons between them, and that how they move between different states and natures. So we worked with sea salt and minerals was one of the things that we worked with, and we had to sort of think about the state of being of salt itself, of sea salt itself, that it was really dynamic, and the sea salts grew at different rates depending on temperature, humidity, the season, the substrate, and the form that they anchored to. In winter, the crystals formed really slowly over several months, and in summer, they grew profusely in a matter of weeks. So the process itself became really performative. There was sustained attention, ladling brine, topping up tanks of solution, ensuring warmth and stillness. The wet cloth drapes and then eventually hardens into the individual forms and finding affordances with rocks and branches and human beings. But eventually, of course, the salt works were dissolved in water. The texture and form of the cloth dissipate, and the ionic bonds of the atoms and the crystalline structures break apart, and salt once again becomes with sea. The work on the left is a cloth that we grew lichen on. You see the lichen on the rock on the left, and growing on the cloth, which is also digitally printed with images of the lichen. And again, that eventually ate the cloth and disintegrated. So in that project, I came to Canada towards the end of that. And one of my first sort of connections to being here was presenting on Français and French a kind of spoken word piece and a digital media piece that was based on my feelings about this particular sand, which you can probably tell I had strong. The next project was called Macro Micro Whakapapa, and this project took on a number of different iterations as well. So this work began with the earlier collaborations with the choreographer, Taiki Gray, and the dancers from Altamira, they did so much work with me, and that was really wonderful for me, and I needed to kind of do something for them. And so I worked with them on this collaborative project called Indigenous Stamina. So they had this dance performance at Q Theatre as part of a big dance festival, international dance festival. And I kind of was, tasked to kind of create some sort of projection work to go with the dance performance. I also ended up making a costume. I'm not very sure how that happened. So, but what I started with was footage from Indigenous activists and dancers from across Australia and New Zealand, and they all sent me different footage. And these footage were of specific sites that were important to them, and sometimes the person would just be filming themselves with a iPhone, with a phone camera, or they interacted with that space. So I sort of built these kind of layers from still images of that footage and formed these kind of sequences of textures. And the image on the left is from the digital artwork that I eventually created during that. And what I did was I worked with the dancer again from Altamira to motion capture them, and I replaced the textures onto the dancer's motion to sort of result in this shifting embodied landscape with the textures from all the sort of crowdsourced bodies of land and bodies of water that had sent me. And the work was first installed during the performance by Altamira, and it's actually projected onto the back cloth hanging there, but it was very soft and very washed and hard to see, and I had to sort of realize that lighting for performance needed to kind of place the dancers in the best possible light, and that I couldn't control, in a sense, the projection work in the same way, but it took on this very ghostly kind of quality. It was then commissioned as a digital artwork for a public exhibition and a digital art live screen in the public square. And then it was commissioned for the International Biennale of Media Art, which toured Australia for 2 years. So it kind of took on all these different moments. Next, I'm introducing a project called Kōpiki Te Moka, and here I visit the bones. And this was an exhibition called Te Whainga, a culture lab that was commissioned by the Smithsonian and Auckland Museum. The Smithsonian had run, I think, around the world about 3 versions of culture labs, where they sort of would come and spend months working with curators and doing these kind of collaborative exhibitions, and this was the final one that they did was in New Zealand. So the artists involved were Hawaiian, New Zealand, Samoan, other Pacific nations. And then the exhibition took place in Silo Park down on the waterfront, and what was really interesting about it in terms of temporality was that the weekend that the exhibition opened was a celebration of the first arrival of Captain Cook 250 years earlier to New Zealand, and where they staged the reenactment of it was directly in front of this entire space that this artist collective, the Smithsonian, had set up our exhibition and interaction. So there was a lot of very interesting aspects about that. The collaborators, of course, were this group of artists, and what was really phenomenal and interesting about this project was the depth of connection between the curatorial team and the artists. And coming into New Zealand, the Smithsonian curators were very conscious of being led by how do we go about doing things here, and so we 6 months before the exhibition, we did a wananga, or a kind of like meeting thing together, and so we sort of, all the artists and curators, we spent about 3 days together, and we just ate food and we told stories and we did these kind of workshop things, and it became a really, really sort of deep collaboration, and many people actually completely changed their project from that interaction and ended up pairing up with each other who they'd never met before and doing things together. And the collaborations actually from that continue to this day, and I do know from Instagram last night that there's at least 3 of the artists and curators from that group at Venice Biennale and supporting. So that's been a really interesting one of being able to be in an artist community and developing these senses of international kinship through expanded kind of ideas. So this is just a brief thing of part of the work that I did there. The work that I did, I went back to my home community, and it was based around a particular mountain that I'm in direct ancestral relationship with. I also did a lot of photographs of grandparents on the land there, and that they kept returning. We didn't own it or anything, they just kept going there in a very remote peninsula. And it was a real pleasure to kind of be able to work with that. And I did a lot of repetitive drawings, and the drawings were put into motion capture again and kind of fed through and some textile artworks and video work. And it was really interesting seeing it being enacted with, and the image on the left is my littlest nephew, and the textile work above him has an image of his great-great-grandmother. So just a little bit there about the connectivity between the artists and the kind of kinship building across nations through these ideas of wanting to make art that speaks to your backgrounds and the complexities of those things. Finally, my current research project, which I'm just sort of touching on a few things very briefly, but I am hosting a workshop in the living station next Tuesday afternoon that goes more in depth into actual processes and protocols from this project. This project is what I've been working on since I've been in WdKA in Montreal. And I'm working with Ile Saint-Helene, which is this beautiful little island just in the river off the island of Montreal itself. And it's described in the Montreal City's literature as being an artificial island, and that first captured my attention because I thought, how can you call something artificial, call nature artificial? And it's because it's been adapted over time with subway excavated soil, and then it's also treated in a somewhat Disney-ified way, where the island itself is rented out all summer long for festivals and dance parties and all sorts of things. Also on the island is at least 2 forests, a wildflower meadow, family of foxes, all sorts of marmots. Sometimes there was an otter there at some point years ago. And so it has these kind of wilderness aspects to it, but then it also is very treated by human involvement, more as where it's not appreciated as nature, it's more kind of used as a place. And on this island, we work specifically with invasive plant species and contaminants. And the approach for that was, I guess, coming from this background that I shared with you of working with Māori concepts and protocols. I realized I couldn't kind of come to another territory and just pick up somebody else's stuff and work with it because it wasn't my stories, it wasn't my histories. I would not know how to follow my processes in the same way. So I started thinking about what would fieldwork methods be as an uninvited guest. Like how do I be a good guest in a place? And so I started working with the invasive plants, and through that I ended up moving along now into looking at pathways of colonization through invasive plant species. And recently I've been in London going through Captain Cook's archive, like through his logbooks, actually reading what ships what they had, what ballast, soil ballast they had in the ships and hold, and they were often with stuff to take. So this sort of allowed me a chance to orientate to a new place in a different way, and think through these questions that I think were underlying for me all along. And I have a really good group of research assistants that I work with, and we think a lot about how we can develop resilient methodologies of working with place, and we think a lot about how what knowledges of contested species and contested spaces can provide us. So essentially within that project, we've been looking at, from the different species, their sort of ontological or whakapapa potentiality, so whether they can become an ink or a dye or a lake pigment or a bioplastic or a bio composite material or paper or pulp or thread or what the material itself wants to become. And through that, I sort of follow those different protocol guides that I've been building up along the way of care and empathy and relationship to place, and thinking about how I can apply that to contested spaces. There's also a lot of rusty metal on the island because it was used in the World Expo 67. Most of which was bulldozed and left to kind of decay under the forest, and we kept finding these larger bits of metal, so we've been working with rust quite a lot, which has been really interesting. Also other pollutants from the island, and through these, working with these different species and things, we've started sort of having these different histories revealed of the colonization, of resilience and adaptation, thinking of new perspectives on belonging and how we know places. So other materials we've been working with from there. And in working with those species, I've come to know some very, very well. And comment here is about phragmites, because it's one of the most prolific plants in terms of how it behaves in its adaptation to place. So Phragmites is throughout the part of Quebec that we are in, and it really likes the salt runoff from that they put down for snow on the road. So it forms all big banks way on highways and things. But it's also even on this island because it has the big plumes like reeds do, and so 2 million seed potentials from one plant kind of thing. And so it spreads very far and very fast. It also makes this really incredible color, and I've been developing this kind of stain technique of slowly building color infiltrations and interactions over a 2-week time period with pouring and drying, pouring and drying. And when I work with Phragmite in this, I notice it wants to not alter another color, like not like when you put red and yellow together you get orange. It wants to make every other color itself. It just colonizes the other colors. It's really interesting. That work is still ongoing, and I have an exhibition at the Biosphere coming up on that very soon. And I had a wonderful opportunity recently to do a residency at BAM in the Rocky Mountains, and this was an Indigenous arts residency where I got to sort of develop a lot of those materials into artworks and think through those. So sorry, I know that's gone a bit long, but I'll just conclude. Yeah. So coming back to those kind of thoughts around field work and what that means and research creation, I thought quite a bit across all these projects about how field work involves learning, that being really active in learning was something that's necessary in it, and that I'm always a beginner. I'm not a biologist, I'm barely a gardener, but I really am very curious to understand what things are and how things work. And so this kind of situated research through looking not only at what a plant does, but who it is, what its stories are, what its sociocultural histories are, what its relationships to people and other species are, has been really interesting. And those things also actually prompt how it becomes a material. So a lot of the things that make up the nature of it have been the solution for it artistically becoming a material. The other thing about fieldwork was that in fieldwork we've brought into attunement to time and temporality, not only from slowing to the speed of seasons, but awareness of the duration natures of ecological material, the lifespan of matter itself, and the manner of transformation. I also wanted to circle back to how deep collaborations have been really pivotal for me, and that they take patience and generosity. And that was really modeled for me by that very first person who had nothing to do with my PhD project and took a textile designer into a motion capture lab and just let me do stuff. And that's been a really, something that I constantly think about, how generous that was, and I try and remember that working with students, working myself in collaborations. But something I super love is how ideas co-evolve through interdisciplinarity, and they're expanded by that as well, that your idea becomes much more interesting when you work with people who have different sets of knowledge than what you do. And I also really firmly believe that artistic research has much to offer disciplinary understanding and can help to connect both the imperatives and the narratives of ecological care and stewardship through taking these stories to the public, but also through working with different domains. And lastly, just to mention how strongly care is centered in field work, and that is something that's like a foundational kind of part of my process now and always will be. But I can't work with a place without thinking of how much care I receive just from being blessed to do research outside and with nature. And so to be in that reciprocity, I really think that we must question what the land needs from us and how we can give care back. And then also thinking through these different through lines, I guess, of culture and being outside of culture. We've all got stories and histories and connections to land, plants and life forms, whether that's as migrants or people of the land, thinking about what it means to be in good relation, but also to be a good host or a good guest, helps build meaningful ways to connect to land through culture and to connect back to culture. Yeah, sorry, that was very long. Because my timer had started differently. Our seance of computers has really let us down. Yeah. We can just open up for questions now before we move on to it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I have some comments.
Oh, you go.
Well,
A comment, not a question.
yeah, a comment, not a question.
Are you a male in academia?
I just thought it was so it's funny to have to come all the way to Rotterdam to present on your work.
Oh,
That's,
thank you.
it's
We We have offices.
We have offices next to each other, but I've never seen all this, you know, so it's really, yeah.
No. True, it's kind of impossible to ignore with nature too, because everything's about survival and pollination, and also just the cyclic things of birth, death, and decay. Like it just goes on. Yeah. So yeah, the erotic is kind of always involved in that. Yeah. Yeah, and it is something that we do have to think about when we're working with different plant species as well.
Question, comments from our audience.
Oh.
Speakers could summarize them quickly, that would be.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. I love when you moderate.
Why am I moderating?
Yeah. I was thinking about space. And confusion in what sense, and whether a plant, like a plant belongs where it is, right? So, but some plants are out of place, like that's not where they're from. And I think it's a good question that you ask, because probably my perspective is informed by having been born and raised on an island at the end of the world, right? So it's very clear what is native species and what is introduced. And we have really robust kind of protections around that now, and we've been very busily trying to address that. But, you know, we don't share a landmass with other places. So things came very deliberately to us. And so here you've got Japanese knotwood, and you've got giant hogwood, hogweed. Noticed that before, but you know, things are less clear in countries which are part of a continent, for instance, right? But in Canada, yeah, it's similar in that some we can find out specific ontologies of, like purple loosestrife, for instance. I know came from ship's ballast around Newfoundland, and so that's they were making, you know, in the 1700s, and so I was tracking a voyage, looking through ship's notes again, trying to find out about that. But and it made its way up the river, and there's now an invasive plant there. But there's others, of course, which, like dandelion is a classic invasive weed, but dandelion now exists everywhere. And dandelion does the most beautiful job for all the other plants. Like it's almost like this really self-sacrificing plant where it deliberately picks the most hard-packed soil, goes in with its taproot, and makes the soil really nice for other plants to come in. So we don't sort of attach kind of we certainly recognize agency within different plant species, but I really try to steer away from anthropomorphizing whether there's a good or a bad kind of, there's not a moral stance of a plant. It's just doing what it's doing, but it's really interesting to see what it's doing. And it is really interesting to sort of trace the stories of what would it be doing if it was elsewhere, or what was it supposed to be doing if it was not doing this. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I think summary of the question, what it is like to be thinking through, how do I embody being a good guest and being a good host? Well, again, that comes from the training I did in Matanga Māori, and that we have a concept called manakitanga, which is like caretaking for other people, like literally being a good host. And so that extends beyond your family parameters to like food, water being central needs of all humans and taking care of people. It's also why we, like, probably to our detriment, why we were colonized quite easily, is because we saw these people who had been on boat for years and looked hungry and thirsty, so we fed them and even grew gardens for them. So those ideas of how I had been received with generosity by people and brought into knowing what it is to be part of that made me think about what it was to be a guest when I came here, because I came to Canada, because one of the strangest things for me being in Canada was the lack of sort of daily or embedded relationship with Inuit, First Nations and Métis people, and just the complete separation from acknowledging that everyone there who's not one of those First Nations groups is a guest, and an uninvited guest. And so it made me really think about it, because I thought, oh, now I like shoes on the other foot. Like, how am I going to go about doing this? Like, how do I be reciprocal? How do I be respectful? How do I center other voices other than myself? Because it's not my place to speak about someone else's land. So so I thought a lot about how I could go about doing that. And then meanwhile, in my research, I went with invasive plants, because I was like, yeah. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Places when you're in front of this camera.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
And then you can find them.
No, but I can actually share. But let's switch.
But that camera's probably better than, and then I can moderate.
Quickly use the washroom. Hey, good.
We're just taking a break before we go to camp.
But I love to explain public section, you know, I have to show you some of the because you want the random actually. So I'm there. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so I am the only, yes, but I don't get anymore. Okay. That was great. Yeah, we got it. Montreal. I've seen this since face, but I don't know. No. At one time. Yeah, right. Hey, maybe. I've seen that around. I've seen that around and that. That one was. Well.
Did you switch places?
Yes.
Oh, perfect.
No, I don't need it though, because I actually have mine and mine actually works better. It'll be better.
Like the great routine.
Kevin will share his slides directly through.
That's perfect.
So I will just turn this video actually off. Oh,
Right. Oh, is there any way we can get it on there too though?
yeah. Can you drag? Yeah, if you you do actually have to plug in your. Somebody needs to plug in. I can do it. Can I? Don't you worry.
It'll work.
I feel like if maybe I can air tame it.
But if you plug it.
For some reason, it wouldn't show. Because I have maybe too many things for it.
Now we have it showing on Zoom, but not here.
Are you connected?
Oh,
You're not connected. There is no computer connected.
Five.
Oh, I guess I could.
Okay, but
Yeah, I can just.
yeah, okay. I was trying to air tame it.
Make sure you have the right.
Feel there's gonna be.
Yes.
Too many things going on. Then maybe I just.
That works well though, right?
That's just.
You see your mouse?
The windows here.
Okay, well, you figure that out. I'm going to read your bio. So,
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Kevin,
I don't see a mouse. That's
oh, so strange.
okay.
You see it?
I think so.
Like which direction? So I will just introduce Kevin as he is finding his mouse. Oh, I see it.
You see it?
I saw it for a second there.
I know it's somewhere.
The hidden mouse.
How do I just close it? Just close it.
I mean, in all honesty, I think it's fine. People still can see. Oh, you did it. Okay, wonderful.
No.
So, I'm going to introduce Kevin now.
Okay, I'll send it.
So, Kevin Yuen Kit Lo is an assistant professor of communications, design, and visual culture in the Department of Design and Computation Arts, working at the intersection of graphic design, cultural production, and social change with a focus on publication practices and social movements. His research explores tension between material and relational approaches to design to support greater social and political autonomy. In 2014, he founded the graphic design studio Loki, collaborating with community organizations, nonprofits, unions, artists, and activist groups on projects ranging from anti-racist campaigns and protest graphics to platforms for critical journalism and publications supporting marginalized voices. He holds an MA in typographic design from the London College of Printing on a different page, and has a background in interactive design, advertising, and fashion, and is a member of the Meme Fest network and the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative. What's my name? Just Seeds. Oh, sorry. And as well is the author of Design Against Design, Cause and Consequence of a Dissent Graphic Practice, which was published by Set Margins, which you may know as a Dutch publisher, in 2024. And I'm just like putting it in there. On Thursday, you're going to shout it too? Okay, I'm shouting it now, in case anyone has to leave. The second printing of his book is happening, happened right now. And so he'll be launching this second printing at kiosk on Thursday evening this week. So if you would like to get the book and hear more about the book, you can come through. So yes, today his talk is called Matter versus Spirit on Publishing Defined Comrades. Thanks, Kevin.
So first I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Had some technical issues. Other things okay. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just checking the Zooms. So hi, yeah, my name is Kit Lo. Bonjour, hi. So I just want to start with this. I'm living in Montreal. And the reason I put the little bonjour hi is that there's all sorts of interesting questions around language that I'm interested in. And in Montreal, the provincial government of Quebec at one point tried to, this is something that everyone says in Montreal. If you ever come, go to a store, people say bonjour, hi, to figure out what language you speak and you converse. At a certain point, 2 years ago, the Coalition Avenir Québec, the provincial government, among many, many awful things that it's done, tried to do the absurd thing of policing speech by banning the use of this phrase to only say bonjour. and you weren't allowed to say hi anymore at stores. Luckily, this was like ridiculed and changed, but I bring this up as I think it's some of the concerns in terms of which I'm working, which work around different questions of language and power within that. So I say I'm from Montreal, and then I got a backslash, and I put Jojage. And you know, I've thought about this in many times. Do I use a backslash? Do I use a dash? Sometimes should I just say Jojage, which is the WdKA language? Should I just say that? How does that work in terms of being guest? Miranda has talked a lot about it in terms of how do I introduce myself. I don't have enough connections that I need to actually say I'm from Jojage. But at the same time, I want to respect that I am on territories. So I think the land acknowledgements that we do very commonly in these kind of academic contexts, in where I'm coming from, are much more complex than I think end up happening in those, you know, usually 3 or 4 sentences or paragraphs. A lot of our software is also very complicated. That happens all the time. Sometimes when I spell my name as well. So again, these questions of language, power, what do they mean, are central to my thinking. So yeah, in Canada, or as I prefer, so-called Canada, you know, which doesn't actually get that automatically, the little red line, but get the idea. I don't put a red line underneath this because I think the scale at which I can feel belonging is in this neighborhood called the Mile End in Montreal. And this is a view from what was in the studio. So been living in that neighborhood for a very, very long time, and you know that I can say that I'm from there. I really like noodles, and this is a little gift that I realized after my friend had taken all these photos of me while I was enjoying my noodles in a restaurant in Montreal's Chinatown called Saigon, which unfortunately is no longer. And Saigon also happens to be the region in China that I'm not exactly from, but close to in Guangzhou. So maybe another place that my family is from. Between 2014 and 2023, I ran a graphic design studio called Loki, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. That's not true. I had a great experience running that studio, but 2 reasons I'm showing this is that I'm not going to be talking about the studio at all. I'm going to be talking about the research that I'm doing now, the research I'm doing now, because in 2023, when I closed the studio, I became assistant professor at Concordia University alongside Miranda. Yeah, that's also to state that I'm a very new academic, and so my approach, might be a little bit weird. This is also my dog, who is named Loki, which was the same name as my design studio. It was not intentional. Also, not my password for everything. You know this. This is Loki, my dog, who when I got him was already named Loki. You know, and as we saw, you know, I've been running that studio for a long time. He also is very local to the Mile End, that neighborhood, and gets all sorts of free food everywhere. And I think that's like the real sign of belonging is when you can get free food everywhere. He's also on the back of my book. So this is, as Sky mentioned, my book Design Against Design, which speaks a bit more, not that much more, but speaks a bit more about actual studio practice and just thoughts I have in terms of working in as like a dissident graphic practice. So most of my work work with grassroots organizations, unions, as Sky was mentioning, activist groups, research organizations, cultural institutions. Like I said, I'm not going to talk too much about that now, but it definitely informs my practice. There's some angry wolves, and then there's local magic. Yes, so as mentioned, yay, book talk at Kiosk Rotterdam, Thursday, 14th of May. Hope to see you there. So a little bit more context about me before I jump into what I actually want to talk about. It's particularly relevant, I think, to a Dutch context. I have a strong connection to the Netherlands, having first come here in 2001, and many times since then. As mentioned, my publisher is also based in Eindhoven. But I'm really here to talk about my age. So I grew up as a kind of child of the 80s and 90s in North America, in Toronto, Canada, Toronto, so-called Canada, and very influenced by different media contexts. And so a few things here. I don't know if people have ever seen the Sony Walkman, and if it brings back some like really strong feelings. It does for me. And of course, that's also George Bush in 2001 after September 11th attacks, and him starting to we see, I think, a pretty significant change in all sorts of things after that. And so that was kind of like my background, but like the main thing that happened around then was Netscape Navigator. So I don't know if people remember Netscape Navigator, again, one of the first, or the first real web browser, which opened up some people that were growing up, let's say, in Toronto, Canada, to this wild world web, world wide web. Yes. Wow. And what that opened me up to, and this is really my shout out to my Dutch friends here, was the NetTime mailing list. And I don't know if people are aware of it. Yeah. Okay. See, I knew you guys would. So the NetTime mailing list, how I found it, I don't even know, but it was really, really amazing, eye-opening thing as I was doing my studies and learning web design. I was also learning very, very fascinated with technology, obviously, digital art, net art, but also being introduced to like a kind of fundamental critical theory that I was just like, I have no idea what these people are saying, but this sounds great. I hear that Lovink is retiring or something like that, so I'm going to try and get up to Amsterdam, and someone said that I could sneak into his office. So that's cool. Also, for people that were on NetTime at that time, something that was really, really significant to me was that it opened up my eyes because there were actually communiques from the Zapatista Army of National Liberation that were also circulated. And so there's a strange confluence of me learning about like digital technology and culture and art, and also digital photography, anti-capitalism, insurrectionary politics, and poetics. Found like Zapatista language, Subcommandant Marcos was one of the like most kind of powerful moments for me as a young developing anarchist. Similarly, at that time, as a designer or design student, kind of thinking through all these things, and Naomi Klein, who is a Canadian journalist, and I wrote a book called No Logo, which is very influential to, I think, design students at that time, just because someone was actually talking about logos. Even if it was in the negative, it was fascinating. So yeah, Naomi Klein's No Logo was really looking at the globalization of kind of brands and how the dematerialization of labor from North American context to places in Southeast Asia, and how the production of these companies now was actually just imagery and narrative. So that's some of the kind of groundings as I was becoming aware of what design was. We're going to jump ahead 25 years later. I did all sorts of stuff, but basically, I think it can be summed up in the fact that like I'm an overly romantic, anarcho kind of troublemaker who somehow ended up now teaching at Concordia University. And as part of my role at Concordia University, I'm like, okay, well, thinking about the type of research I want to do, and it's always actually been consistent in that I've always worked in different publication practices, making a lot of books. Books have always been deepest loves. And so this was at these images are from the New York Art Book Fair in 2024 on the left here, or the right, I guess. It was kind of surprising me because I just like one of these posters was like basically announcing the 30th anniversary of the uprising from the Zapatista National Army of Liberation. It made me feel old, but also kind of was like making me think about what is happening in these places of these art book fairs. One of the things that was happening in 2024 was we were trying to push for the publishers there to sign on to PACB, which is the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott Initiative. They did not, but we staged a walkout of the book fair and held a moment to speak about these issues. And like the book fair itself became this kind of tense political time. I was there with a cooperative that I'm a part of, which is called Just Seeds, which do graphics, movement graphics, basically, and talk more about that later. So I was there table with Just Seeds. We do movement graphics of all sorts, a lot of printmakers, printing, etc. And you know, at the New York Art Book Fair, which I'm sure is similar to any else that has gone to book fairs here. I know you have lots, a lot of books too. Great. You know, you have on the bottom floor, which were the most expensive floors, you know, limited edition art books by conceptual artists that were selling for, let's say, $5,000-$10,000 possibly, you know. And then at the upstairs, you would have people, maybe, you know, I don't want to be too like stereotyping, but like kind of like trusty punks that were, you know, selling their zines about how to make pickles. Great, I love pickles. And then you had us as a kind of like, and I'll just say it bluntly, but it's not more complicated than that, but like kind of a woke washing, right? So we got our table free because, you know, we gave credibility to the political context of this book fair. So I started thinking of the space as a really interesting space where like what's actually tying that downstairs ground floor to the people on the fourth floor and their pickles. And of course, it's the form of the book. It's a codex, and the fact that the codex can actually like connect all these very different political and ideological frameworks, while at the same time also celebrating, say, 30 years of Zapatista uprising, was really interesting. So that started becoming kind of the focus of my research. At the same time, again, 25 years later, reading Dominic Klein, we just put out this book called Doppelganger, which is a really interesting take in terms of like our current conditions and like how the kind of the relationship between the virtual world, social media, etc., and kind of new forms of fascism that are happening now, and the kind of dynamism of that. So this started becoming kind of the overlap of what I was trying to think about, which ends up being this. So this is where I'm going to talk a little bit more. So Matter versus Spirit, I'm publishing Defined Comrades. It's my current research. And I'm going to talk about it in a bit of a boring way because I only just recently got some funding for it. And, oh, well, this is actually a bit more exciting, and then I'll go to the boring part. Yeah, what do I mean by publishing Defined Comrades? And I'm trying to figure that out. Like, viscerally, it's basically a book as a shield. And it's a book as a shield amongst other books and other people carrying them. So this is a strategy or tactic, I guess, called the book walk. I don't know if people are aware of that. It happens in all sorts of different political protest contexts, where people will make riot shields out of different books that are pertinent to the particular moment of protest. Obviously, it works as a communicative device. It works as a rhetorical device. In protest, there's a lot of visibility around it. But it's also acting as a very material form of.
And so that's really kind of central to some of the things that I'm thinking about, where, yes, I'm thinking about are we influencing things on symbolic and on a semantic level, but also how are we influencing things on a material level? And those are always the kind of tensions that I'm playing with. So this is a boring part in which I was going to maybe read some of my application for funding, which I just got. So Matter versus Spirit is a research creation project in the field of design studies, investigating publishing as a material practice in relationship with contemporary countercultural production and social movement studies. So basically what it's saying is I'm going to be making some publications that are asking some questions around this. But I see the creation of the press itself at the university where I'm at in our visual communication lab as the actual design object that I want to be thinking about, not necessarily the things that I'm producing. So I think, as Miranda was saying, showing these different projects, the different projects, I'm really trying to think of this project as what is the through line here, not necessarily the individual things as much as I like making the individual things. So the idea is to set up a micropress in the university in order to create kind of a pedagogical research examination and a community print resource. This is not an original idea, but I think hopefully the ways in which I'm thinking about it are original. I'm thinking about what publishing means materially, gesturally, and relationally, and hoping to develop anarchist analysis of print culture. And I'll explain a little bit more about that afterwards, but trying to see how these kind of acts of publishing can intervene upon or subvert existing discursive regimes. And also really looking at, as a designer, micro-political material decisions. And again, I'll show what I mean by that a little bit further. But yeah, I don't have any kind of overarching argument that I'm trying to make, but I want to produce these objects and allow these objects to raise questions. And that's sort of how I'm seeing the building of this research. So being a graphic designer, of course, the first thing I did was make a logo, right? And so this is our cute little animated logo. I'm really not an illustrator, but I had super fun drawing this. People might not recognize the source, but you may be aware of the larger creatures, which are really usually associated with this, which are these Chinese guardian lions that stand in front of most Chinatowns. There will always be two. And one of them will have a lion cub underneath their paw, and the other one will have an embroidered ball. And I'm Chinese, but the only reason I actually really know all this is because I wanted to get a tattoo of that lion, and then I did some additional research. But it was kind of perfect because so the embroidered ball, which is you can see in a lot of different cultural contexts, it's used it has been used to if you have a crush on someone, you throw the ball at them back in the day. But it's also representative of the kind of material world, whereas the lion cub, the kind of baby, is being protected and cared for by the kind of phenomenology is the notion of the spiritual world. So the fact that these two symbols, which are coming from my culture, which is pretty interesting, reflected directly on this kind of notion of the material and the spiritual, and this kind of as Miranda was saying, thinking around new materialism, which is coming from, actually an ancient materialism, kind of really resonated with the project. So this is the actual visual communication lab at Concordia University. And like having walked around here in the last day, I'm like kind of sad, you know, like this is, I was like, my pride and joy. We have 4 tables. So very, very envious of the studios that are here. But at the same time, I'm very, very motivated to make my little space, our little space, as lively as what I see here. So this is the actual physical space, and the project really will revolve around that as it develops. And on the other side of this room, see, it's only one room that we share, is is the soft surface lab where we have some sewing machines and some busts as well. I really love this space, though. We do have very good light, and the goal here is to really, at least through my thinking, trying to find ways to activate this space as how a press might work. I had one of the students in another class kind of developing the visual identity for it, and I just thought it was kind of cute as his solution. And then we have one Riso printer with one drum and a few colors. Again, just being a little bitter here. But we've decided to use the off prints there as the actual set of kind of bones of the visual identity of the lab. So this is maybe a little bit of an inside joke, but maybe not for people. So you guys got my net time joke, but maybe not my Cocoon joke. So I'm thinking about this through the idea of like preliminary materials for a theory of the young micropress. Maybe people online will get that joke. And of course, as we talk about certain things, I am new to this sort of stuff, but me reading The Mushroom at the End of the World by Anna Tsing introduced me to these kinds of ideas of new materialism, which I was not familiar at all with before that, but really as a method of study, not so much as in relation to the actual subject matter of the Matsutake mushroom, which was fascinating, but also thinking about logistics, power flows, all these different things, which somehow in my mind started transforming these mushrooms into zines. And I was then connecting that to this historical text survey called Letterpress Revolution by Kathy Ferguson, who's a researcher an anarchist researcher, feminist researcher in Hawaii. And she's done this kind of really brilliant kind of ontological study of the role of printing within the anarchist movement within the period of like 1800s and 1920s. And her argument is really, and this is, I'll get to this, where it's not only that these presses were producing materials for the movement, but they were actually constitutive of the movement itself. So many anarchists were printers. She looks at it from a really materialist perspective as well. So the way that the presses were working with the bodies of the printers and how that in itself enacted a form of anarchism. So that's another kind of really grounding text for me. And then, of course, The Undercommons by Stefano Hardy and Fred Moten. If people are aware of this, is a brilliant text. Very, very dense, but poetically beautiful. I mean, I'm not going to try and summarize it because I can't, but it makes, you know, as a new academic and entering into a world where there is a certain level of infrastructure and privilege, how to kind of position the work that I'm trying to do as a way of sharing resources from the institutions to things outside of it, or things that have been marginalized by it. And then finally, maybe again, more familiar to some of the publishing folks here, is the work of Paul Sewellis and his concept of urgent craft, which I know has circulated through the Netherlands very, very richly over the last decade or so. And of course, the beautiful setup that he has at in Rhode Island, queerarchive.org. And so thinking about this notion of urgency and craft. And that's kind of these contrasts of like, what does it mean for something to be urgent? What does it mean for something to be craft? Are really, really, yeah, just like nice provocations for the type of work that I want to be doing. So generally, all this kind of thinking is, again, this is not going to be surprising for the publishing folks, but thinking of publishing primarily as an act, as a gesture, as a practice that is repeated. Obviously, to publish is to make something public, and obviously to publish is also to make a public. So thinking about the types of public that we want to be creating with the types of work that we want to be doing. What I'm hoping to bring that's maybe a little bit new is thinking of publishing acts as like a constitutive force for social movements. And then through Anna's work and the kind of approach that she took to our ethnography, kind of the art of noticing. So how we use attention in the specific context of platform capitalism that we're living under. Logistics and promiscuous infrastructure. So a title that I share with Sky here, where thinking about flows and the structures that connect them, scale and speed, visibility and opacity. Just have recently been named the assistant director of the Dark Capacities Lab at Concordia University, which is a BIPOC lab focused on BIPOC study, strategy, and aesthetics. And so really thinking about this notion of opacity, when do we need to be visible? When do we not need to be visible? How do we manipulate the gaze? So it's these types of questions that I find really interesting as well, especially in relationship to scale. And of course, this material and relational studies of design. I find obviously people's practice like Miranda's and others are really breaking that down, but I think there's been a traditional kind of separation between these approaches. You know, I had a real challenge while I was running my studios, dealing with all these design studios that were practicing social innovation, that basically delivered sticky notes to communities that needed material change. On the other side, we have these technically, materially sophisticated designers who are just fascinated with making objects without thinking about their contextual and relational lives. So it's really in this tension that I tend to place my work. And I think I learned that this is like a almost equals but not quite sign. I don't know. I just thought it was cute. In terms of methods, again, like I said, young researcher, so I'm very influenced by my peers, like Miranda, and also Dr. Riela's, the doctors, Riela Khaled and Pippin Barr. Pippin, who was here a few months earlier, which was where, like, when I was reading through their work on the method for design materialization, which is a methodology that they use in game development and game design and game research. I just found it incredibly straightforward and actually made me think, okay, I am already doing this type of work, and the important thing is just documenting it, you know, at all the various stages in which the work is happening, so that it can be recuperable, it can be material, it can have these traces of design activity that can then be studied and researched. And so it really has given me confidence in terms of being able to apply a rigorous documentation methodology to something that was really just happening in my head before. So this is like the schematic that is on their website. And you can see that it's a bit more technical, and also like the GitHub repository for Pippin's game Snakeisms. And so I'm not a developer. I don't use Git. So I was like trying to work through, how am I going to be doing this type of work? How do I translate their approach where they're making commits and commentary on their commits to a publishing practice or a graphic design practice? And so I kind of flipped it around a little bit to like think of like, where are the key points for me in my research methodology? And it always starts with existential angst. or questions, and then trying to kind of like frame that angst, or why am I feeling that? Why am I so anxious about this? And what is the context of it? And then trying to generate some kind of overall concept or like ideations around what those questions are. And then having some like actual material inputs. I'm like, as a designer, I'm not trying to work necessarily with my own quote unquote material. So where does this come from? Who is this coming from? What are the relationships between into those material inputs? Design and experimentation ad infinitum. That can be as much as like designing something graphically on the computer, or material tests in terms of different printing and binding methods, et cetera. And then the actual production, the materials, the financial and budgetary constraints of the project, documentation. So that's the point of like, not necessarily just documentation for the MDM process, but actual documentation for the design process. And of course, distribution in publics, which is like an incredibly important question at some point, and feedback analysis, which then leads to, of course, more existential angst. So it's my cycle of angst, which I take as my research method as well. In terms of documenting it, like I said, I don't really use Git or things like that. So I started a blog. And I was like looking for a place to like kind of just work through these ideas, and thought of like, I think some people are using like Substack now, and things like that. But it was also algorithmically aggressive. And I've recently been pulling away from social media for all sorts of different reasons. And I discovered, I tried to find the simplest thing possible. And I found this Bear blog that was developed by this one guy named Herman. And it's 2.7 kilobytes of code, and is a fully functioning, perfectly smooth, very, very quick, totally transparent blogging platform. So I'm just here to give a shout out to people that might want to start blogs again, and give it a little shout out to Herman, and like, how cute is this logo, like, and it's been an interesting process to do a blog again after, maybe 15 years when I used to blog. And so what I found is that there's a whole movement, and I'm sure maybe some people are aware, but this whole kind of indie web movement where, people are trying to find ways outside of the main commercial platforms to produce material, to have spaces, to create digital gardens, et cetera. But what I thought was really interesting in discovering all the different blogs on this Bear platform was that essentially many people were blogging about how they feel about blogging, about how frustrating it is when they couldn't come up with an idea for something to write, or how they really need to have a practice of writing, or how it feels to be exposed, or maybe they're changing the theme of their blog and adding different colors or changing the fonts. And what I recognize is, like, I was trying to see what's the difference between, let's say, blogging and being on Substack and posting a newsletter, right? And the kind of level of like self-reflexivity and vulnerability, but actually also critical engagement with the platform itself, was really interesting to me. This kind of like meta-analysis where you're actually talking about the tools that you're working with, right? You're not going to see someone on Substack writing about well, maybe you will, but not that much, about Substack's ownership structure, et cetera, or all that, like, I don't think that really works. Whereas people here, like Herman goes and says, like, meets people and he has coffee with them, And this brought me back to thinking some of the into notions of like the I can't say this word, epistolary, which means letter writing. And Kathy Ferguson in the Letterpress Revolution book talks a lot about exchanges between different anarchist printers, and she talks about how these people are like not necessarily like, obviously they're fully formed humans, right? But thinking about how the agency of actually the exchanges of that letter writing, those connections and those relations, that produce the conditions of possibility for radical politics. So this started like getting in my head thinking about these digital platforms and these material platforms. And so I started making stuff, and these are some of the outputs, and I'm just going to go through them quickly, and I'll hand hand some of them out afterwards for people to look at or to take. The first thing is the blog itself, and this is like honestly the very first time I'm actually like sharing the URL, so you guys can feel very honored. It's very hidden. The only person that sees it is our chair, Pippin. He's the only person that sees it, and my partner, Anchi. So this is the very first time, and it's been really interesting. Again, this process of blogging, I think, is like really psychologically interesting as I extract myself from social media platforms, where like I will still check, because you can like something, but that's it. There's no comments. There's no, there's no anything. You can't share stuff. You can't like, it's great, but like I still, when I post something, I'm like, did someone like it? And it's just like before, like maybe I would have like on my social media stuff, be like, oh, only 50 likes. Oh, gotta get up to 100 something. But now with this, I'm like, it's like 2, and I'm like, cool. And so it's like this thinking about scale is like starting to really sink in terms of that. But like those 2 are often Pippin, and Pippin will tell me how much he liked what I just wrote. And so that's like really not just sweet, but it's changing the evaluative system outside of an algorithmic model, So the first thing that I started on the blog was like thinking about all the book fairs that I was going to, and the types of books or the types of publications that I was interested in. And there's a few sites out there for this, but there's not a lot for actual reviews of what we might call the artist book. I don't like to, I'll get to that in a bit in terms of like terms, framings, but so yeah, going to these different book fairs with my book and picking up different books that I found were interesting, but not finding necessarily a place where things were being reviewed in the same way that I was kind of interested in. I decided, okay, I'll start with that. Unfortunately, I've only got 2 up, but I hope I will be able to produce more later. And this one in the middle, America, a Cold Game, is by a studio in St. Louis called Work Play. They do some really, really amazing work. And I remember flipping through it at the New York Art Book Fair, and it was such an experience. And I actually couldn't even open my copy for like a year after I got it, because it was like really, really intense. And it's basically just a sequence of images, like 180 pages or so, of screenshots, of little notes, thoughts, popular culture, different moments that he had collected over the years, living, as a Black person in St. Louis. So I'm just gonna play and what was nice is, so I wrote that review, and I shared it with him. Well, sorry. I shared it with him, and this might be weird. How am I gonna get the audio to work? I'll give it a try.
Let's see if we hear it.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just gonna share a message that he sent me after.
So much more. But I felt like this wasn't enough of a pace to get it. And I got myself under it in terms of, I wish it wasn't really about fancy ivory or gold foil or embossed covers, that was not the premier focus. Was more so the image of the sequence. We totally know that that's exactly what I wanted people to focus on, is the sequence. The sequence is the book is just an entertainment, but that has been years and years of images that have been collected, recent notes, conversations, and things that I've read. They're all in the book, read notes. And now we look at this building, there's a prophecy in that. My mentor talked about there being some turmoil in America, the election that happened. The January 6th, insurrection. It's all in there. I think now this is kind of time that period, time that the span of time that has happened. And now we look at what's going on in the world today. people can't even talk about certain things without being targeted or labeled as wokeism. It's not wokeism if it's talking about history. It's happening. So I'm going to share this slide. And I think people should read it and really see for themselves. Like, you nailed it. You completely nailed it. Everything that I was trying to stuff. You nailed it. You had to sat with it to see it and pick it all up. For that, putting that type of time, taking time to check it out. I am extremely grateful for that.
Oh my God. Okay. Sorry, I didn't realize I'm very bad. Okay, I'm gonna just go quickly through a few things then. So this is our first publication. I was always getting to the end here. Yeah, it's about our logo, or it is our logo. And some of the things that I was thinking around it are like, what is the, sometimes we talk about the minimum viable product and product design. I was thinking, what's like a minimum viable publication? Like, how can I find these definitional terms? And so I came up with this list, printed paper, multiple pages, possibly structured as codex, contains text and or images, exists in multiple copies, has a formal relationship with other publications. And then what's a minimum viable publisher, right? And what do we need? Some of these things I don't think you actually need, but my graphic designer instinct means like, okay, we need to have a logo, right? Etc. Place to store publications from back to boxes. So really trying to think in terms of like, what's the minimum that I need to do? And then there's like thinking about the different types of publishing that could be and the types of publishing that I'm interested in. And so there's this like whole like list of things, and I'm sure some people identify more with others. I don't really know yet, but there's also the notion, obviously, of expanded publishing and experimental publishing that I feel probably runs through a lot of the currents here. I'm very, very much interested in that, but I was like, as you saw, like I'm interested in paper and ink primarily. So I think I'm coming up with a new term, which I'm going to call condensed publishing, like condensed milk. And the other thing that I thought was really funny is in doing that research while I was making the logo for this publication was that I found the printer's mark for Aldus Manutius of the Aldine Press, which is this dolphin and anchor, which is like make haste slowly, which immediately made me think of this. So trying to think about this notions of like, yeah, time and speed and scale. This is the second publication. It's a bunch of moons, ribograph printed onto black Japanese paper, with a little insert of an exercise that I give assignment I give my students called acts of noticing. So this is the exercise in class where basically, oh, I don't need to explain it. It's okay. People play around with pictures and learn about noticing things in their environment. But it's really a critique of platform capitalism. So really trying to think through how our attention is distributed, and hopefully the zine acts as a kind of small poetic kind of statement on that. I recently read this book, and it's not, to be honest, not the best book, but I really needed it at the time. So How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell, Resisting the Attention Economy. It's pretty good. I shouldn't qualify it like that. But I think what I really hooked onto is that I picked up this book. I think it's from like 5 years ago or something like that. But now there's so many books on this now, And so I think this was an opening up to us trying to be in different ways in this time. So her quotes, it is with acts of attention that we decide who to hear, who to see, and who in our world has agency. In this way, attention forms the ground not just for love, but for ethics. And then the notion of context. Context is what appears when you hold your attention open for long enough. The longer you hold it, the more context appears. And then finally, this is the last publication. And this is a series of typefaces designed by my students. It's something that I love type, I'm very interested in, and I wanted this as a collaborative project with several students that have done these in my class. It's really important to understand that they're actually like first-year students. So they're coming in, and our program is not a graphic design program. As you can tell, it's a general design program. So what's nice about it is that they come in with a bit of a open idea of what typography might be, and not the current kind of fixed ideas of what typography should be. And so some of these are the typefaces that they've designed, and they've granted me the permission to distribute them and to showcase them through these publications. I also made one because I just couldn't help it. And really thinking about, again, through Soels's questioning about how a language can be loaded up and shaped with surplus of meaning above and beyond conventional standards of good typography and design, and really thinking about the distribution methods of typography. So quickly, and this is the end of the story. I was going to spend more time on it, but there was a whole kerfuffle in 2021 when the CIA rebranded and used typeface by the Swiss designers GT America, Brillitype, GT America. And when people saw that, they were kind of questioning, oh my God, that's actually their typeface and the rebrand, et cetera. And Brillitype saying, well, you know, our type, anyone can buy it, right? It's not up to us to control it. In 2024, of course, it was rebranded with a new administration of Trump. But surprisingly, they still stuck with Brillitype and used just Sectra instead of GT America. And then this is how they describe themselves, right? But just because we're Swiss doesn't mean we're neutral. We make type with a point of view, type that conveys meaning beyond the words it spells out. What matters to us is this: what story does a typeface tell? What kind of personality does it have? In the context of how the type is used, how the type is marketed, it's true. What story does this typeface tell? More recently, maybe again within little designer circles, it was pretty funny because Calibri was removed, and Trump, well, actually Marco Rubio decided to reinstate Times New Roman at 14 point across all their official documents, thinking that Calibri, because it was made to be more legible, was woke. It's not quite as simple as that. Actually, I actually really hate Calibri, so it's not, I'm not personally affected by it, but I do think that the decision to make this change and to announce this change and people's responses to it, you know, it's not often typography makes it to the news. When we have these kinds of responses, I think they are symbolic of something kind of interesting going on. So like, how do these things have these loaded meanings, right? So this is VTC Martin by Vocal Type or Trail Seals, who really came onto the scene in 2016, carried by the Black Lives Matter movement in the US as one of the only Black typeface designers of any sort of repute. And he's got a practice of looking through historical lettering from different protest movements, different social movements, and designing typefaces around this. So this obviously a reference to Martin Luther King. And see how it's used. And at the time, because of the limitations, I think, of, well, not limitations, because of the systemic racism within the type design industry, there was basically Joshua Darden, who was an amazing type designer, and Trey Seals, and people that were trying to be respectful or responsible started using these typefaces quite a lot for all things within a context of racism, you know? I'm guilty of that too. I don't put mine in here, but I also used VTC Martin, but it was everywhere. And so there's a certain limitation of this visual language as it gets codified into what it might mean. And we have a really defined aesthetic, you know, construction around that. Netflix.
Oh.
Ben's Best Blends. I think this is like a weed company that does something good. And then it starts to lose that a little bit and just become something that, you know, has this nice industrial reference. Diana's Seafood in Toronto, great place actually. And of course, you know, these types of prebiotic agave soda. So just that kind of quick thing. So just trying to think about like what gets carried on, what doesn't, and the end user license agreement as like maybe a creative site where people are looking at the legal permissions of what a typeface can do. So people started with that CIA kind of incursion. People started writing, okay, you can't use this, you can use this font to do this, you can use that, and trying to think through that. A lot of this has been removed, but it's also like pretty much impossible to enforce. But it becomes a kind of interesting site where maybe things can happen if we're trying to think about how does distribution work, et cetera. So finally, this is our font, and merci, thank you. Sorry for going long.
It's also definitely the 10 computers fault for starting in visual aids, so thanks very much. We have the time just for a couple of questions. Yeah.
I'm going to have to run, but it's really fitting because but I hope we can cross paths again maybe Monday.
Definitely,
like,
definitely.
Because I mean, yeah, I'm running to a train now, but I hope as well that you have time. Either both students from Expo and huge amounts of affinities between the work that these guys are doing. Yeah, I hope indeed that there's so
On Monday?
Yeah, great.
yeah. Yes. Thanks so much.
No, they could. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we're running late.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I was thinking about this. So in the beginning, you were talking about setting up this small press. And I saw a woman in Norway give an amazing talk. She was doing her doctoral studies, and I wish I could remember her name.
Oh, I was just about to write it down.
But at the time, she was doing a study at the London School of Economics on alternative anarchist press.
Oh.
And she was studying, I mean, and what was great about her talk is that she talked about the economic models and how they were often having to do porn by night, pay rent for their spaces, and do the anarchist publishing with funding they were earning.
Yeah.
And the other interesting thing was that she spoke about the general fatigue, like the struggle of her doctoral studies was the fact that not a lot was documented because often it relied on volunteerism, people, burned out or whatever. And I was thinking in terms of an educational and thinking through these presses, how you could get those other immaterial mechanisms in that wear people's butts out when they're trying to do the project, or just the very stealing from Peter to pay for Paul, these kinds of economies, seems to me really interesting. Like what constitutes publishing a press, and even all that invisible stuff.
Yeah. I mean that's exactly the types of interest I'm like looking at. Like I said, the publications themselves are just I mean, they're not just, I mean, they are their own thing, but it's a provocation to think through exactly those types of questions, like I like my publications. They're cute and all, but it's really, like in releasing a typeface, it's like, okay, well, how am I, what is the distribution model for this? How will I collaborate with my students? How am I going to remunerate them or not? What types of agreements? And then like who gets to, and so like that's exactly it. Yeah.
It's a really interesting one, and in some ways there's a lot of critique about the art school in the sense that we isolate students from the very economic things that they face, and that's a great way to prototype through what is the press's vector, but also as community.
And labor. I mean, and labor, and I think when we tie back to presses in my thinking, it's like that, like the international type of ITU, which is the International Typographers Union in the US. They were one of the largest, most powerful unions that basically won the 8-hour day in the US. So the relationship between like labor and press histories and all this sort of stuff is all, connected. Yeah.
I know this is a question, but just off of that, I'm thinking about like, your anarchist sort of background, like grounding and your entry point for publishing, and how I feel like I remember as a teenager encountering zines
Yeah.
that rose my political consciousness, didn't at all seem to concern themselves with any kind of idea of infrastructure of publishing.
Yeah.
Imprint or anything.
Yeah.
It was like, how do we get this information in people's hands and like literally handing out on the street?
Yeah.
So I just think that's interesting also to like think about maybe this like idea of urgency around these ideas is not like, okay, we're not publishers, but we're like publishing information, we're spreading information because it needs to be out there.
Yeah.
So that's accessible. Right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I come from like, totally the zine culture, and so, and I think like I've been talking where it's like, this is like, what are these histories too, of these types of like publishing, right? We like, that's a samizdat or self-publishing, all these different sorts of things. But that's why I think that like having those zines in the same room as a $5,000 artist book, it's like, I'm trying to think about how does that, what's going on there, right? And it's not that it's wrong or anything like that. I'm just trying to think of like, how does that form of the codex or the book actually link those things together, Yeah.
Also, the slow and fast, like in the histories of suffragette flags that were like delicately embroidered. And then in the making, what is that as community building? I mean, there's all kinds of
Quilting and
And between the two of you, if I think about like what draws me so much to books themselves is almost this like life force and energy held within the material, the body of the book too, and absolutely touching it and the relationship with it. And
Oh, he's got a face chain on. Look, we look great. Look at that.
True. Wow.
Hi, Sky. Hi, Miranda.
Good. No, he's got.
Thank you so much, Doug, and everybody at Fourth Space.
Thank you all.
I didn't forget you, but my computer died, and I'm very sorry.
It happens. It happens. It's okay. We've had people coming through, seeing, checking it out. It's been pretty fun, and it was great to be able to connect. But yeah, we'll wrap up the Zoom now and go
program.
Go have a fun evening.
Really good. It's a beautiful academy in Amsterdam.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, okay.
And right now.